Welcome to Next in Tech, an S&P Global Market Intelligence podcast where the world of emerging tech lives. I'm your host, Eric Hanselman, Chief Analyst for Industry and Company Data at S&P Global Market Intelligence. And today, we're going to be charging into a continuation of the conversation we've had around data. It's something we want to do as we kick off our first episode of Pride Month. And we'll be talking about some of the concerns about personal data, echoing some of the things we've been talking about earlier. And joining me to discuss this is returning guest, Emily Jasper. Welcome back.
Thank you.
And Alan Moore. Alan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, it's great to have you both here. This is something that, Emily, we've been talking about this before. Paige Bartley's been on talking about some of the regulatory and compliance concerns about data. And I wanted to extend that conversation into some of the issues around personal data, some of the risks that are associated with it, and some of the things that people should be aware of, really getting our data fluency a little further out there. But I guess maybe we start off with just sort of digging into a little background in terms of some of the issues, some of the ideas. What are we working with here?
Yeah, we wanted to take a moment and think about the power of data and understanding that there is just a shifting landscape when it comes to personal data. We don't just have that GDPR use case anymore. There are a lot of different ways we think about personal data. And it just felt like a really good time to kind of lay out the landscape again, but also think about what does that mean for implications for companies and their people programs.
Yeah, it makes sense. If you look at a lot of the pressures that exist right now with AI basically hoovering up all the data on the planet, it starts to create a set of requirements to ensure that we really are understanding how the tech that we're putting together is going to leverage that data and where it's going to wind up and what those concerns are.
Well, let's actually maybe think about what are we talking about when we first look at what is personal data and maybe what some of those regulations might be looking like today. And that's why it's exciting to have Alan join us. This is his background and bread and butter. And he also probably spends a lot of time learning and diving into all the details outside his day job.
Yep, I absolutely do. Happy to talk about that a little more. So one of the things that I do just want to point out before I jump in here is that all the views I'm expressing here are my own and not those of S&P Global or anyone in its legal department, and they are, of course, not legal advice. But in this shifting environment, one of the really interesting things we've seen is surrounding employee data collection. For years, companies have had these self-ID programs where people could report certain details about themselves to give companies a better picture of who was in their workforce. One of the trends that came out of that is regulators started seeing value in some of that previously voluntary shared data. So previously, employees might have had the option to report personal data like gender. Well, that turned into things like gender pay gap reporting in France, which imposes an obligation on companies to collect some more personal data because they can't complete the gender pay gap reporting unless they know the demographic breakdown of their workforce. I know in the privacy field, one of the ways that we tried to respond to that is through data minimization. That really remains one of our key principles, and it's one of the key principles underlying a lot of the global privacy laws and regulations. And in really any context, the point we always try to drive home is that organizations should only collect the personal data that they actually need to perform those legitimate business functions.
And that's something that we see in the technology side all the time, right? It's an old data security mantra, right? The easiest data to secure is the data that you don't have.
Exactly.
And I think the model even came from, enterprise resource planning, ERP days. And if you think about it, we've essentially taken, like Alan said, this data and applied it in other use cases. Well, the ability for a firm to then document how they then made decisions based on that data, that level of accountability is in some cases unclear because if it's not necessarily a regulated report or requirement, then it opens up that question of what are you doing with this data? And it may have been a completely valid collection to, you know, think about budgeting. If you are aware of how many benefit claims in your healthcare benefits you're providing to employees related to pregnancy or birth related claims, because you have a number of women within a certain age range documented, that allows you to plan for that set of expenses. However, in some cases, companies aren't necessarily forecasting like that. It may also open them up to questions about why are they forecasting like that. So then you end up with this: should we collect the data at all if we aren't actually applying it for these business decisions? And I think Alan's right. In some cases, it's more important to be minimal because you can document what you're doing with it, and it is informing the business as opposed to just, let's just have it. Let's just have a little bit of everything.
And I think the other interesting piece here, when it comes to what personal data people share with, especially their employers, is there are some cases where even if they're not required to share it, they might still want to. They might still think there's a valid reason. For example, somebody might choose to share their sexual orientation with their employer so they could be connected to resources and programs and other things that might be interested in. But in a lot of cases, the employer doesn't actually need that information. So even if there are cases where they don't have to get it, there might still be some value in at least making that sharing an option for individuals.
That may be a range of needs that could benefit the employee, but yet the organization has to be aware of what those potential challenges are of retaining it and potentially then having to secure it over time.
I think about any of the HR system related projects I've ever worked on, and data migration is hard. So, if your company is even switching personnel systems and they have to migrate data, you do also, thinking about those data backfills. Are you going to do that, or are you going to essentially recreate that self ID program? Those are opportunities to identify if you need or should be collecting the data. Is it voluntary or not? How have you determined how you're leveraging that for business use cases? And then is is it securely stored? That part just, I think, is something that not everyone is always thinking about. And that's, at the end of the day, that's part of the reason, you ended up with these privacy opt outs when it came to marketing content, because it was very clear that that data wasn't getting necessarily stored and was in some cases getting sold. So, if you think about it from an employee data perspective, the same thing applies. You want to make sure your employees feel trust in what is happening with their personnel information and their personal data, while you still might have to take on technology requirements, technology investments, and all of that, especially to maintain that security.
Well, it sounds like a situation, again, that we've talked about before, which is shifting thinking about data. A lot of times people talk about data being the new oil, and it carries with it that idea that it's going to be used to fuel new opportunities or water or whatever. Pick your analogy. There seem to be so many out there, but this is really thinking more about the data with a little more gravity in terms of where it's headed. There's been a joke going on in information security circles about data not being the new oil, but being the new plutonium, in which you've got to treat it carefully, and it can be tremendously powerful, but you have to really keep track of where it goes. But fundamentally, it comes back to changing the way in which you think about data. And Emily, to your point, not just simply collecting everything you possibly can, but understanding what it means to actually have, whatever that particular data element happens to be, and what you expect to be able to do with it.
Exactly right. And it's interesting to see some of the evolving expectations around how data will be used and just the changing views and opinions and levels of education on what can actually be done with personal data. For example, somebody might think that just your name and your zip code and maybe part of your telephone number, like, well, that's pretty low risk personal information, no big deal. But when you pair just a few seemingly simple data elements together, you can really get some pretty detailed information about people when you start putting these pieces of the puzzle together. And I think another big change that we're seeing here and we've seen over the last few years is with more distributed and remote workforces. That means data is going to a lot more places and is being stored in many more places than it might have been even 5 years ago. And it's a fundamental reality that you can't properly secure data if you don't know where it is. But if you collected it, you're still responsible for it.
Well, that's a good point, Alan, which is, well, on two fronts. One, data as the new water, I think, is always the analogy that I like to use, just simply because of the fact that it leaks out of everything. It collects in puddles. It winds up in places you don't expect it. There's so many different aspects to actually keeping and managing control and making sure you're not soaking yourself in all the data that's leaking all over the place. That's a challenge. But the other thing I wanted to identify is, I think, a really important point you made about the reassembly of data. It's something actually that our regulatory teams and Paige Bartley have been talking about, which is the challenge that AI creates, which is that you may think that this is data that's sufficiently anonymized, but with a zip code, some demographic information, it's all too easy for AI engines. Again, their whole point is to build context and associate data to maybe recreate what is effectively PII, because they're able to bring in so many different data sets that might have been harder to do originally. So it's one more reason to really start thinking about what you're accumulating and where it's being accumulated.
Exactly right. I think a great example is something in my own apartment building that management inadvertently discovered a couple years ago when they installed a new electronic access system. In the elevators, there are little cameras in the locks that are unlocked with an app now. So we discovered that every time you hold that app up to the lock to unlock it and activate the elevator getting into the building, it was actually taking a picture. All these pictures were getting stored in this vendor system. So if it's not being properly protected, just by looking at the swipe data there in those pictures, you could get a really alarmingly detailed picture of somebody's daily movements in their own residence.
It's a lot of unintended consequences lurking out
Exactly.
there.
And I think with AI, there is that pressure to kind of hoover up data, like you said, Eric. And so when you're in that situation, you have to remember that these AI models, while they are supposed to kind of thread with context, in some cases they may not actually have that context because it's, again, the nature of just grabbing a lot of stuff. And we talked about this last year when we covered our NLP research during Pride Month, and that in some cases the different types of phrases that were used, as they became more generic, it was yielding vague statements around company commitments. And so, again, if you think about the data around an employee, if it's potentially um, you know, enough that you could connect it to several other elements, it goes from being like a vague picture to a specific picture. And again, in an employee scenario, do you need that happening within your business? Does the company need to see and collect? I think about badge scans, right? That's done often for security at office doors. We think about RTO, returning to work as a component of that. Um, well, if that's then also tied to some of your other personnel data, like Alan said, there's then a potential that AI could talk about when you're next going into the office. If it automatically reserved a desk for you, great. But if it then told your boss that you didn't show up, that's where you get into privacy concerns as well.
Yeah, it starts getting into these issues about how those are interrelated. And the privacy piece is, of course, just as critical.
And one of the things that I really think about with AI is just the risk of incorrect assumptions, because any model is only as good as the information it's given to work with. So, for example, if an AI model sees that someone is a member of an LGBTQ plus organization, it might assume they identify as a member of that community. Maybe an accurate assumption. They may just be an ally who wants to join up and help out. But models, I personally think, aren't quite yet at the point where they can differentiate among context like that, like a human could.
Well, the whole point is that they are attempting to infer context and they are filling in the blanks, right? That's the whole issue with generative models. And they're taking a look at existing patterns and filling in the blanks based on what they've seen. And the constraint is there that they don't necessarily have context that is as extensive as what they're being called upon to actually deliver.
And that context can really be key. One of the things we saw earlier this year with AI is researchers had created a model that was actually able to detect cancer much earlier than traditional medical exams and testing could. Well, one of the things that I would imagine, speaking as a non-medical professional here, that model is going to have to accommodate is for different cancer risk profiles across different populations. The question that naturally comes up there is, well, how are you ensuring that it's getting enough data from the right places to be able to accurately assess the risk and accurately fill in those blanks?
Well, Emily, it gets to the point that I think we touched on when you and Abby Simmons were on earlier, which is those ideas about ensuring that the base of training data really extends across the complete set of communities you're looking to serve, and that it represents those populations, because that can be a challenge building data sets for training.
It's funny, thinking about that when we were doing the NLP reporting and healthcare earnings calls and specialty conference calls were a part of the transcript data. It was quite interesting because the reference of, especially in the earlier 2010s, there was a lot of mention around AIDS prevention and medication that was done by some of these pharmaceutical firms. And so mentioning that some of the subjects were included in a homosexual population was context for the testing for a medication, as opposed to a company saying that they have like a non discrimination policy. Same types of keywords, two wildly different ways you would interpret what that company is doing with that data. And again, I think that is where AI might eventually figure that out, but it took me and the NLP specialist going through and pre-scoring some of these to say yes and no. The model picked this up correctly, and the model picked this one up incorrectly. And you know, that's still a lot of, like, looking over the data on a regular basis.
There's still a lot of work that has to be accomplished in order to put all of this together. I guess it seems like that raises that issue of we need to collect enough data to be able to go build good models, and yet concerns about privacy are going to hold off the extent to which you want to collect. It seems like we wind up being in a bit of a catch-22 in terms of how we actually effectively address training, and what is that hopefully bright future on the AI side.
It really can be a catch-22 situation, because I think the other layer to this is, in an increasing number of jurisdictions, we're up to now a majority of countries in the world and approaching a numeric majority of US states. We have these comprehensive privacy laws that give people many more rights and much more control over their data. Well, in many places, they have the right to say, no, I don't want you to use my data to train this AI model, no matter how valuable its purpose might be. So, I think it's good. We want individuals to have that degree of control over their personal information, but it does also limit the information that goes in to train and improve these AI models.
Well, I think it gets back to making sure that we're ensuring that we have a solid understanding of what data is being used for, that there is consent, but there are these aspects in terms of how an individual company is leveraging this data. I guess it starts to be something where we need to think about how that could potentially impact both internal operations and efforts for the organization themselves, as well as those externals. So it's a set of different considerations in terms of where that has to go.
Couldn't agree more with that. I'm a bit of a privacy history nerd as well. And one of the first pieces of privacy legislation in the United States was the Privacy Act of 1974. Now, it had limited scope. It only applied to federal executive branch agencies. But the basic principles underlying it were tell individuals what of their information you're collecting, why you need to collect it, how you're going to use it, who you're going to share it with, and how you're going to protect it. And that's really the common thread that we've continued to see in almost every piece of privacy legislation since the mid 70s. So as rapidly as technology advances, those basic expectations from individuals that inform lawmaking and policymaking really haven't changed.
Well, and when you've got a solid base to build on, I guess the basic principles endure throughout that.
They really
But I
do.
guess that's something that has to extend to enterprises in the same way.
Well, and I think one area of reassurance that employees could look at through this, maybe daunting landscape is checking where their company or employer may have made these statements about what's happening with data. For those of us who might interact with a consumer brand or on a website, right? You see things like the cookie disclaimers, you have the privacy notes that are often in the footer of a website. And think about that same thing applying to your internal intranets, your personnel systems, and things like that. And I think being able to seek, find, and identify where that documentation is will help you understand how your employer might be using that data. And also being aware if something is considered a self ID, you have the ability to go in and usually edit or make a change there. So I think knowing that you do have some of that power over your own data privacy with your employer is really important. Um, but also remember that there may be those types of programs that support, coaching or talent or things like that that could benefit from maybe not personal information the way we're thinking about like gender or orientation, but might benefit from things like your skills, right? In many cases, some of us don't go back into our employee profile and outline all those skills that we've maybe collected over the 7 to 10 years we've worked for that employer. So think about that because that might actually be more of a professional benefit than you originally thought.
Yeah, that's a good point. I know that I probably haven't updated any of my AI training in my, so and maybe that's a good prompt for me to get back to it. How should organizations think about really better engaging around this? And I guess, who are organizations to partner with? How do you start to get a better view to really understand how to better manage this process with or without the data that's potentially available?
For all of the cool new things that technology can do, I think there really is no substitute for simply having good working relationships across organizations. And that starts by just getting to know your colleagues and business partners and learning how different teams can support each other. One of the things that I enjoy doing is just asking questions like what challenges other teams are facing, what resources do they feel they might need, and I think this is the most critical piece. What are they hearing from their frontline employees? And is that information being shared with the stakeholders that it needs to be?
Well, isn't that the critical part of any real effective technology approach, which
It
is
is.
setting aside the technical pieces and getting back to really understanding what the impacts are on people, what their expectations are, and how they want to work with it, as opposed to dealing with technology for technology's sake. I mean, my team spends a lot of time sprinkling AI pixie dust on a whole bunch of different technology problems. But realistically, it's how the people who are the end beneficiaries of all of this that really the important part of that conversation.
And by keeping people at the forefront of these conversations, that will never eliminate the risk of something going wrong, but I think that can substantially reduce it. You really can't go wrong by keeping your people top of mind.
Absolutely. Well, it is something that I think also we want to keep an eye on what that overall process is, because we're talking about trying to build benefits and helping the entire employee population throughout the organization. And it's something where I think we need to put some thought behind what the goals are, and keep in mind that there are aspects that you may want to revisit, you may want to go back to, and some things that maybe you were cautious about data collection to begin with, that maybe there are benefits to be able to collect on whatever basis makes sense. Again, depending upon what those outcomes are that you're looking for.
I would also say, as there's a lot of expertise being, delivered in this space, especially from organizations such as SHRM and of course, obviously, regulatory authorities. Um, I think it never hurts to go back to the goals of what was that data going to serve? What purpose was it serving? What programs was it helping inform? And then identify if and when you may have needed that, and are there other mechanisms for proxies of that type of data, or are there better programs that you could be leveraging, like, again, talking about, encouraging employees to revisit their skills listings. I think at the other end of the spectrum is that if there's a pause on certain personal data collecting today, and there's a future where you might want to recollect it, this exercise of evaluating of what did you do with that data, what programs did it inform, I think that goes into then the justification of if you do want to in a future state recollect that data, again, be really clear of what were you doing with that? What were the expectations? Did you measure those goals? I think many of us have seen um, programs that might get rolled out as a pilot, and then nothing might not, nothing may come to fruition from that. So I would challenge businesses is that if you are looking at some of this data, you know, project manage that. Like, get those programs together, get those results, identify, how many employees benefited from this. Um, Again, it's that people first focus. I think it'll really change the way organizations consider managing that personal data when they're really thinking about those outcomes for the employees.
And when you think about it that way, it can also just reduce some of the risk as well, because questions like, how was the information used? Did it lead to any useful outcomes for people? I mean, those are the typical types of issues that regulators look at in determining an organization's compliance.
Those are important insights when we start thinking about what is such a complicated subject as this. There is so much more that we could do to dive into this. And as usual, I'm left with a herd of questions that we aren't going to be able to dive into on this episode, but certainly look forward to discussing those as we roll through a lot of this continuing conversation. It has been great to have both of you on the podcast. Thank you both for your insights.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much again.
Well, and once again, we get back to that conclusion that we really have to be all about the people, and especially when we start thinking about the data aspects, what we've been talking about. But that is it for this episode of Next in Tech. Thanks to our audience for staying with us, and thanks to our production team, including Sophie Carr, Fran Mudation, Kira Smith, and Adam Kowalski on the marketing and events teams. I hope you'll join us for our next episode, where we're going to be talking about data center building progress, where we're actually going to house all this data, and what's happening in some of the dynamics of that market. Dan Thompson's going to be back to talk a little bit about that. I hope you'll join us then, because there is always something next in tech.